Dr. Ellie Pridgeon here today. Dr. Pridgeon is a lecturer in History of Art and Architecture at a number of leading UK universities, including Oxford and Cambridge. She is also Director of Consultant Archivist, a firm specializing in records management, digital preservation, and archival research services. Dr. Pridgeon is a professionally qualified archivist and records manager and has been working in the archives, libraries, and museum sectors since 1998. In 2008, Dr. Pridgeon received her PhD in medieval art history from the University of Leicester. Her project focused on using archival material to find evidence for the patronage and iconographical change in English and Welsh medieval wall painting. Dr. Pridgeon is a council member of the Church Monument Society and co-chair of the Business for Heritage Network. She is also a member of the Archives and Records Association, and in 2016 was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London for services to archives and academia. Ellie has also worked alongside Dr. Miriam Gill on the Church's Conservation Trust wall painting project. Her publications have helped to greatly expand our knowledge of English medieval and post-medieval wall painting. Her most recent articles include Understanding the Three Living and the Three Dead in England, Marking Time and Space, the Medieval Wall Paintings at Ron's Church, Northamptonshire, and Patronage and Function, the Medieval Wall Paintings at Lecoq Abbey and Wiltshire. Dr. Pridgeon is also currently writing a book on St. Christopher wall painting. Today, Dr. Pridgeon will be speaking to us about medieval wall paintings here in Oxfordshire. This will help relate us to wall paintings produced here at Chalgrove and with others in the area. Please help me welcome Dr. Ellie Pridgeon.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Oh, that's fine. Okay,
yeah.
Great, thanks. Right. Hello. So, that's fine. Right. It's great to be here today. I haven't actually visited Chalgrove Church for about 20 years. I realised it is. I thought it was quite recently, but clearly that was not the case. Although 20 years does seem quite recent to me. But actually, I was telling a few people I have pre-digital photographs of Chalgrove, so that goes to show really how long ago it was. So everything is rather changed here, and although some things are obviously the same. So it's great to be back finally and to be invited back. That's excellent. Now, today I'm going to talk about Oxfordshire wall paintings and about particularly thinking about contextualising chantry chapels. And that's in relation to the idea, whether it be correct or not, that this space, the chancel here, may have functioned doubled up perhaps as a chantry or private chapel for the manorial family. There's a big question mark over whether that was the case. But I'm going to look at a couple of other examples and make some comparisons, and to think particularly about wall paintings located possibly within chantry or private chapel contexts. I'm going to look at South Newington. When I said to my friend and colleague, Dr. Miriam Gill, that I was going to talk about South Newington, and she said, oh no, not again. I think it was the idea that almost everybody has written about South Newington, spoken about South Newington. It's been over the last 10, 15 years, it's been a lot of publications on South Newington. Why can't you do something different? Well, I'm also going to look at Wigford, which has been not published almost, there's almost nothing on Wigford. I haven't had an awful lot of time to look at Wigford. I'm only just beginning, and I haven't, as I said, really had time to go out and look at it because of COVID and lockdown and things, but these are some kind of initial thoughts, essentially, which will relate back in some way to the chancel here. Right, I'm not sure how to use
It's the bottom, Ellie.
This one?
The bottom one.
Bottom? Depends which way you're holding it.
It does, yeah, that one.
That one?
Yeah, and if you point that at the red. There you go.
Great. Excellent. Now, I'm sure that many of you have either been to South Newington or are familiar with it. Now, the reason that I want to talk about today is to flag up perhaps some things which haven't been flagged up before, Most researchers are interested in comparisons with illuminated manuscripts and also patronage of the Gifford family. There are, of course, coats of arms, the Gifford family, who were almost certainly the patrons, but I want to look at one or two other aspects that haven't been flagged up. So if you haven't been, do go along to the church. Excellent, brilliant wall paintings that Paul flagged up in the morning session, so really very impressive. So, yeah, sorry, we just need to go back. Can you get that? Yes, excellent. Right, so I think what's interesting about South Newington that we see here is that we have a north aisle.
Yeah, the middle one should be.
We should have a training session before we start. Right, so South Newington then, we have a bit of a different setup to here because the wall paintings are actually in the north aisle. This is the wall painting location here. Now, this strongly indicates, the north aisle location strongly indicates that it was a chantry chapel. Unfortunately, the documentary evidence relating to South Newington is almost non-existent for various reasons. So we don't have any documentary evidence for that, but I would suggest this is a chantry space of the Gifford family. The evidence for this is the Gifford heraldry within the chantry chapel. The paintings within the aisle are concurrent, they are of the same scheme, and they are also of the same date. North aisle location is commonly a chantry space. A good comparison is Corby Glen in Lincolnshire. And there's also potentially architectural evidence as well within the north aisle that I'll point out as we go along, that this was a chantry space. Chantry meaning a private chapel that was set up by an individual patron, very often the lord of the manor, like the Gifford family at South Newington. So this is just an example of the surviving heraldry which relates to the Gifford family. There are all sorts of different paintings, and I'm not going to look in detail at the paintings or at the kind of East End paintings. I just want to flag up one or two because so many people have worked on that. I don't feel like I've got very much to say, but I'm interested in the kind of the wider context of the chapel. So this is the north aisle that we see here. So I'm interested in kind of viewing, really kind of how viewers, how the laity, how visitors to the church, how congregations, how members of the family who were permitted access into this chantry space, which would have been screened off, how they actually interacted with and how they, could they actually even see or view the paintings themselves beyond the screen? So that's my interest today, really. This is a 12th century arcade that we see here, but you can see actually that we have the north aisle windows on this side. I'll show you the exterior in just a moment. These date from about 1330 to 50, according to a very reliable architectural historian who John Cannon, who is a PhD student at the University of Bristol, and he's my kind of go-to on architectural style. So it's been very helpful, essentially with giving me approximate date for these kind of spaces. You can see it's very important with buildings. The same goes for this building, of course, is to look at the exterior as well and to examine the exterior. These are the north aisle windows, again, kind of mid-14th century. These are flat-headed windows, which are rather different to the pointed Gothic window decorated style that we see at the East End. Deliberately, we would think, designed perhaps in a slightly different manner, but I'll talk about that in just a moment. This is just the north aisle exterior again. So it's really important to examine the context. And here we have the east-style window, again from the same date, but it's different, it's pointed, got a pointed top. So this is arguably deliberately designed like this in a kind of, you know, in a what might have looked like a slightly older style at the time. I'll talk about that in just a second. There is potentially evidence for the parclose screens. So parclose screens ran across, well, very often they ran across between the piers. I imagine that this was a chantry chapel at some point in the medieval period, so it's very likely that the nave would have been screened off. I have I've given my photographs from Corby Glen in Lincolnshire to the team at Cambridge. They is it Lucy Rapson with the who worked on the screen project, and she said it's at Corby Glen. These are definitely kind of these Maltese tendon joints. I haven't shown her this, but I imagine this is perhaps evidence here that on the piers of where the area was screened off, and that would have been a private standalone chapel which would have had a chantry chaplain, a chantry priest attached to it, who would have said masses for the souls of the family, essentially. So this is just to give you a bit of context around wall paintings and how important it is to look at the architectural features and the details, essentially. There's Simon Roffey from Winchester has done some incredible and really interesting work on essentially on kind of mapping the churches, and he looks, one of his studies is on squints, essentially. So he's actually physically gone around to churches and looked through squints, you know, when we have a squint here, to see what you can actually see through a squint. So, you know, it's this idea that, you know, what did the medieval person actually see? And if you sit down, can you see something different? And actually, if you test that out with a squint, that is the case. You can actually see a different part of the wall, you know, if you're sitting down, or if you're at the back of a chapel over here. I did try it over here. So it's a big question mark about what these squints are actually kind of aimed at. What are we supposed to see through the squint? I mean, traditionally it's thought that they're kind of lined up with the altar, but one of his big arguments is actually no, that they may have been lined up with other aspects of the ecclesiastical building, including images as well. So big questions over those, essentially. So, but back to South Newington, we have a large prominent east window. In this particular chapel, or probably a chantry space, the window functions to frame the medieval altar, which is underneath, and to draw the viewer or the visitor's gaze towards the window itself and ultimately up to heaven, guided by the pointed ecclesiastical looking window. And we have a lost St Catherine on the left on the window display here, and then an extant and very beautiful St Margaret here. Essentially the function of these figures is to flank and highlight the altar zone, inverted commas. So it's very interesting with wall painting schemes, because you have these, I know here Kathy Oakes has done a lot of work on it, but essentially, you know, it's all about following the kind of, you know, very often, particularly with Gothic art, you know, follow the fingers, follow the pointed hands, essentially. And you will often find I found this mainly in South Newington, that all the figures face east, almost all the figures face east. There's one that does, I think, is it the Virgin, which doesn't, I can't remember. I promised myself I wouldn't talk about the Virgin Mary here, because that's the one that everybody is really excited about. So yeah, it's all about these figures all have these kind of functionalities within the space. Yeah, so each image, of course, within the space, and this goes not just for South Newington, but also for what we see here at Chalgrove. Each individual image has an individual function. So at South Newington, for example, St Margaret, who was invoked during childbirth, for instance. So a lot of these saints had their individual functions and roles. But they were also, if they were located within a chantry or a private chapel space, they also had a kind of an additional level of functionality associated with intercession, salvation, commemoration, and also the Mass as well. And we certainly arguably see that in relation to Chalgrove as well. Now, we also have to remember about, and this also relates to Chalgrove, about the fact that the viewers of the paintings are potentially limited in these spaces, and certainly within the chantry as well. And I know Paul spoke about that, the fact that these are screened off, either by a reed screen or by a par-closed screen. So, you know, there is some kind of lack of access to a certain extent, but Simon Lockey, who I mentioned before, has suggested that the general laity might access chapels on feast days, special occasions, but in most cases it was the patron and the family and the chaplains who actually entered into the space, which would also go largely for the chancel paintings that we have here. A big question over whether the Brereton family were permitted into the space. We imagine so, if they were the patrons. So lots of questions there. And also, chantry chapels and paintings kind of had more localised functions, really. They enhanced family pride, patrons within the general community, and local identity, and also the temporal and spiritual authority of the patrons and the family as well. So there are lots of different kind of functions which are going on there. Now, again, in the last 10 years, so many art historians, but also historians, have undertaken work on these paintings at South Newington. These are the martyrdoms of Becket, Thomas Becket on the left. So you can just about make out that he is here with his hands in the medieval prayer gesture, and this is an altar here, and these are the knights behind. This is just a detail. And next to this on the right is, of course, the martyrdom of St Thomas of Lancaster, who is a little known, or a much lesser known saint. That has a whole kind of political story behind it. I don't want to go into very much detail about that because it's not relevant to what I'm talking about. But we think the reason that Thomas of Lancaster is depicted here, adjacent to the martyrdom of Becket, is because of the connection between the Gifford family and the Giffords, and certainly the Gifford family. Their kind of headquarters was at Brimsfield Castle, just outside Cirencester, between Cirencester and Gloucestershire, and they were great supporters of Thomas of Lancaster before he was martyred or executed, whatever. So, but I don't want to talk about that because many people have actually spoken about and written about this. But essentially, these do make up a kind of narrative scheme with the saints' lives, and they give the political allegiance there. There's no doubt about that. There is a kind of narrative. Obviously, the artists or the Giffords clearly, saying we've got our own saint. If he's a political saint, he is our St Thomas of Lancaster, and he is as wonderful, or almost as wonderful as Becket, but putting them side by side like that, essentially. And Thomas Becket, of course, was one of the most popular saints in this period. So that's clearly what is being done here, but that's not new at all. I mean, the kind of questions that we can ask around wall paintings, and a good example is at South Newington as well, doing this, is we can see here, this is Becket painting here, and this is the nave, So actually, if you're standing in the nave, you can actually view Beckett. Beckett is much more visible, actually. And it's not until you actually enter into the chantry space here through the Parclose screen that you can actually see properly the St Thomas of Lancaster. So arguably St Thomas of Lancaster is more of a kind of a private image, arguably, because he would be visible by family members, the members of the Gifford family, for instance. These are just some ideas, but a lot of it is about kind of sight lines, I think Simon Roffey calls it. So yeah, and also the Beckett painting that we can see here is also larger, is larger, in fact, more prominent than St Thomas of Lancaster. And also the Beckett painting, as you can see, is located above the north door, which functioned as a processional route. So that's also significant because the laity would have, almost certainly, had access to the back of the chapel here. There would have been a gate, almost certainly a door, because they needed to undertake their processions. That was part of the liturgical year. So actually they would have had access, we think, to the back of the chantry chapel through on, again, feast days and high days, holidays, and that kind of thing, essentially. But still, so again, the Beckett painting is very public in relation to the kind of, individuals in the church nave, essentially. I know it's not very easy to see here, but both Thomases are, I've put them up at the top, but they are both in a devotional position, both facing east towards what was probably the chantry altar, so very significant that they are. In fact, Beckett is actually depicted kneeling at an altar, which reflects essentially the function of the chantry space and really the focus of the chantry chapel. It's reminding the viewer of that. There's also, I'm sorry you can't see it on this, I've got some wonderful photographs that someone I know has taken, but I didn't feel like I could. I wanted to look at the kind of context rather than the detail itself. You'll have to believe me, both Thomases have got bleeding necks. There's a kind of emphasis on red and blood in these paintings, which potentially perhaps links to the Mass as well, which Cathy Oates, of course, has flagged up in relation to childbirth as well, in her now not so recent article. Right, okay, that's fine. So, the second building that I want to look at and make a few comparisons with here, and just to get us to start thinking in a more kind of contextual way, or just thinking in a contextual way, full stop, is Whitford, also up the road, just on the border with Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. And this is an interesting building, and as I said, I did start to look at this, but I haven't looked at it in detail, so there are still a few questions in relation to this particular building. Here's Whitford Church, one of those tiny churches in the middle of the field, a two-cell church, absolutely tiny, very little space inside. Has some wonderful wall paintings, including St Christopher painting and a coat of arms painted over the top on the north wall, always in the position they should be in inverted commas. So well worth a visit if you haven't been there. And this is the interior, so again you can see that it's a very, very tiny building with not much in the way of space, no additional chapels tagged on the end, doesn't even have any aisles, so it's a very different building to this particular building. Let's quickly have a look at so this is what I was talking about before when we had the questions. This is the Chancellor at Whitford, and we have on the north wall, sorry, let's get back, skipped on one mistake. No? Oh, okay, that's fine. Right, so interesting, very interesting setup. So not dissimilar to here in the respect that we have like a piscina here, much lower status. We don't have a sedilia or seat at Woodford, I don't think. And certainly you'll see in a moment the paintings are much lower status than they are here. We have an aumbry here, which I think you probably have up here too. Well, I thought it was an aumbry. But certainly we have this example here, where essentially this was a kind of liturgical cupboard, ostensibly. And as you can see, we have remaining wall paintings on the north wall here. There are also these painted niches, which were probably the patron saint of the church, I would imagine. Virgin Mary, I would imagine, but there's very little remaining. But what I have become interested in recently, and I don't necessarily have any answers to this, and as I said, Dr. Miriam Gill and I have just written a chapter for a book on representations of the three living and the three dead and the dance macabre in Europe, which will be out, I think it's published by Brill next year. But we've been looking at locations, and she of course wrote her PhD on medieval wall painting, so has a very vast appendices, has a very, essentially which lists the location of these types of paintings. And this three living and three dead here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. These are the three kings. And these are the skeletons. I'll show you a manuscript illumination in a minute so you can kind of get your eye in. But this is the only example that we found in the entire country which is in the chancel. So that is so significant, which is why we decided to write about it, because it was so important and we didn't have any answers. But we thought if we wrote about it, then an answer might come to us, or somebody else might give us an answer. So it's very interesting from that point of view, because as we were talking about before, these morality paintings, and that's what these are, essentially. And this is a three living and three dead from the Taylor Powers from the British Library. This is about 1320, so approximately contemporary. Just to give you an idea, we have the three living here, the three kings or nobles who go out into a forest, usually holding a hawk. They're often represented hunting. They meet the three skeletons, and the three skeletons mimic them and say to the kings or nobles, what we are, one day you will be. So it's essentially a kind of tale about morality, about how you should behave. Now these types of images well, 99% of them are in the nave, because they're kind of aimed at the laity, at members of the congregation. But we do have this one example locally to us, which is not, and that is a bit of a question mark. Right, these are the kings here, three kings, and then these are the three skeletons here, or remains of the three skeletons. Okay. And they have inscription as well. I'll just talk a little bit about that before I wrap up. So the three living and three dead, very, very complex images, but they're essentially what we call a memento mori image, which is essentially this idea of reminding people that they're eventually going to pass into the afterlife, into purgatory. In fact, this is monastic in origin, the three living and three dead, and it focuses on the kind of spiritual benefit of contemplating human transience. As I said, it's a warning to viewers. Need to prepare for death. And we think that the three living and three dead images probably intended viewers to inspire pity for the dead as well. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And the three living and the three dead is most frequently found in the Office of the Dead, within illuminated manuscripts. And the dead are often found parodying the elite terror, essentially, appeal for pity, empathy, and also to appeal for intercession for prayers for individuals. Sorry, this is completely normal. That's the one. Right, need to go on. We're nearly there. Right, okay. We also have inscriptions at Woodford. So we have the inclusion of vernacular titular or inscriptions, essentially, which is quite interesting. Often Three Living and Three Dead have actually inscriptions in the vernacular, so they tend to be in English, Middle English, etc. And therefore, clearly aimed at the laity, different kind of your Latin inscriptions that you find in other types of imagery, or perhaps in chancel images. And the viewer's sense of pity is probably enhanced by depictions of the dead as ancestors of the living. I'll talk about that in just a moment. So, location at Woodford then, and we generally thinking about location. So the nave and sometimes the chantry location for the Three Living and the Three Dead is most common. So I do say we have been saying nave, but actually there are some examples of chantry chapels, in fact, where the Three Living and the Three Dead do appear. For example, Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, which has a Three Living and the Three Dead. This does happen. So essentially, the chancel location of Woodford, so this again, remember, is in the chancel. So this is essentially suggests a commemorative and intercessory function, which is aimed at a few earthly supplicants permitted to access the space. So this is essentially going back to what I was saying about, there's only going to be a limited number able to access this chancery area. And arguably the intercessory prayer, the power in fact of the intercessory prayer and the likelihood of salvation is probably enhanced as well by the presence of the Mass within the space. So the kind of power of the image arguably becomes more powerful once you move it into a kind of chancel space like this. It's a very kind of powerful area, if you like, in the medieval period. At Woodford as well, the positioning of the Three Living and the Three Dead towards the east end is right at the east end of as you can see, this is where the east wall comes across as well. The Three Living and the Three Dead towards the east end of the chancel and also above the awmbry or cupboard suggests a raised status and also prominence for this painting as well within the scheme. I'm not going to talk about the other paintings in the scheme because we haven't got time and it's too complex. But you can see essentially from what I've been saying that the location of these paintings is very, very significant, and the location essentially in relation to architecture and other features, of course, is of great significance, or was of great significance in the medieval period. You can test it out by actually standing in the church and to see if you can actually see, this image by when you stand in a certain part of the building. So we're quite lucky from that point of view that we do have these paintings and also the architectural framework for the paintings essentially still surviving. Right, so very last slide then, before I sum up very, very quickly. So, this is the final question about the Three Living and the Three Dead at Woodford. The patrons, it indicates a lay patron of rank, because many of these Three Living and Three Dead, we know that the patron was, for example, at Raunds Church. I've recently done some research on and published an article for the Harlaxton volumes. We know that the Caitlin family, almost certainly the Caitlin family, commissioned the very high status Three Living and Three Dead painting there. So it does suggest a patron, perhaps arguably, of higher rank. Noble and knightly pursuits depicted within the Three Living and the Three Dead include hunting, and we can see here the image from Whitford, would have appealed to elite audiences. You can see the hawk or hunting bird that the king is holding there. And also the inscriptions at Whitford actually refer to ancestors and heirs as well, so it's to do with kind of patronage generations and families. So it indicates that the painting here may function to enhance secular status of the patron of family, arguably, we think. Big question, did this chancel space then at Whitford actually function a bit like possibly here? Actually as a double up as a chantry or lay space as well. Now this is highly unusual in the medieval period, and I'm not suggesting that this was definitely the case, but it's certainly something to consider when we have, we have the location of an image which is just so unusual and not found anywhere else. We need to start asking questions as to why this was actually the case, and obviously we know about Chalgrove. We've already looked at this throughout the rest of the day. So, very quickly then, to sum up, I don't think I've got anything which is radical to say in terms of a conclusion. I think mainly just want to put across the points that we need to examine the architectural space, the wider sacred space. This is essential when studying wall paintings, both here, elsewhere in Oxfordshire, and also, throughout England, Wales, and Europe. Not just for wall paintings, but for other media as well, which are within, we have surviving and also lost within the ecclesiastical space. Also, the examination of the precise image location within the scheme is also absolutely vital, where these images are located within the scheme, where they're located at Chalgrove, for example. These are very, very important for us to think about in great detail. Clearly there are similarities and differences between Chalgrove and other Oxfordshire wall paintings. Apart from South Newington and Chalgrove, there's almost nothing published on Oxfordshire wall painting, or nothing modern anyway. So this is really an area which is under-researched. So, if you're interested in undertaking some research, or publishing something on Oxfordshire wall paintings, this is a great time, essentially, because it's very much a kind of under-researched research area. I have some things to publish, but I don't have any time to do any publishing, and fortunately I have almost no time at all, because I have a day job. So I do have things to publish, but unfortunately even writing an article takes months, years sometimes. So if anyone else is interested, then take up the baton. But I hope that's given you a bit of a context, essentially, to start thinking perhaps about the Chalgrove paintings as well in that kind of context too. So thank you.